The fluorescent lights of the Crossroads Diner hummed softly against the darkness of the Illinois night. It was one of those truck stops that seemed to exist outside of time, a place where weary travelers found refuge between the endless miles of highway. The smell of fresh coffee and grilled bacon hung in the air, mixing with the faint diesel exhaust that drifted in every time someone opened the door. Earl Thompson sat in his usual booth by the window, his calloused hands wrapped around a ceramic mug of black coffee. At 54 years old, he had spent more than 3 decades behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, watching America unfold before him mile by mile. His face was weathered by years of sun through windshields and sleepless nights on lonely roads. Deep lines etched around his eyes told stories of laughter and sorrow, of reunions and goodbyes that happened in parking lots and rest areas across the country. Tonight, like most nights, Earl was alone. His wife of 23 years had passed away from cancer 18 months ago, and since then, the road had become more than just his job. It had become his escape, his therapy, his reason to keep moving forward when standing still felt unbearable. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Dolores, with a kind smile and tired eyes, approached his table with a steaming plate: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a thick slice of cornbread. Earl's usual Thursday night order. "Here you go, honey," Dolores said, sliding the plate in front of him. "Can I get you anything else?" "No, thank you, Dolores. This looks perfect as always." She patted his shoulder gently before moving on to the next customer. Earl picked up his fork and was about to take his first bite when movement outside the window caught his attention. A figure stood in the shadows near the edge of the parking lot, hovering between the pools of light cast by the overhead lamps. Earl watched for a moment, his fork suspended in midair, as the figure seemed to debate whether to come inside or disappear back into the darkness. After what felt like several minutes, the figure moved toward the diner. As they stepped into the light, Earl could see it was a young man, maybe in his early 20s. His clothes were worn and dirty, hanging loose on a frame that looked like it hadn't seen a proper meal in weeks. His hair was matted, and even from inside the diner, Earl could see the exhaustion weighing on his thin shoulders. The young man pushed open the door and was immediately met by the warmth of the diner. He stood just inside the entrance, his eyes scanning the room with a mixture of desperation and fear. Several truckers glanced up from their meals, then quickly looked away, returning to their conversations and their food. Earl watched as the young man made his way slowly down the aisle between the booths and the counter. He wasn't heading toward an empty seat. Instead, he was looking at the tables, at the plates of food, at what remained after people had finished eating. When he passed a recently vacated booth where the dishes hadn't yet been cleared, he slowed, his hand twitching at his side as if fighting the urge to reach out and grab something. The young man stopped at a booth 3 down from Earl's. An older couple had just left, their plates still sitting on the table with scraps of food remaining. A half-eaten roll, some leftover hash browns, a few bites of scrambled eggs. The young man stood there, staring at the food, his body trembling slightly. Earl set down his fork and watched. He had seen a lot in his years on the road. He had seen people at their best and at their worst. He had seen kindness that brought tears to his eyes and cruelty that made him question humanity. But there was something about this moment, about this young man standing over someone else's leftovers, that struck him deeply. The young man's voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke, but in the relative quiet of the diner, Earl could hear every word. "Is there any food left on your plate, sir?" He wasn't talking to anyone. The booth was empty. He was rehearsing, practicing what he might say if he found someone willing to share their scraps. The words came out broken and ashamed, the kind of shame that only comes from having to ask for something as basic as food. Earl felt something shift in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time, a feeling that had been buried under layers of grief and numbness since Margaret had died. It was the feeling of being needed, of being able to do something that mattered. He cleared his throat and spoke loud enough for the young man to hear. "Hey!" The young man's head snapped up, his eyes wide with fear. He looked like a deer caught in headlights, ready to bolt at any moment. Earl gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Sit here." The young man didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes darting between Earl and the exit, as if trying to decide which option was safer. "I'm not going to hurt you," Earl said, his voice softer now. "You look like you could use a hot meal. I've got more food here than I can eat anyway." It wasn't true. Earl had been looking forward to this meal all day. But something about this young man made him want to share, made him want to help in a way he hadn't felt compelled to help anyone in a long time. The young man took a hesitant step forward, then another. He moved like he expected the ground to give way beneath him at any moment, like he had learned that good things didn't happen to people like him. "I don't have any money," the young man said, his voice rough and cracked. "I can't pay you back." "Did I ask for money?" The young man shook his head slowly. "Then sit down." After another moment of hesitation, the young man slid into the booth across from Earl. Up close, he looked even worse than Earl had initially thought. His cheeks were hollow, his skin pale with a greyish tinge that spoke of poor nutrition and too many nights spent outside. His eyes, though, were what caught Earl's attention. They were brown, the colour of autumn leaves, and despite everything, there was still a spark of something in them. Intelligence, maybe, or hope, or the stubborn refusal to give up that some people were born with. Earl pushed his plate toward the centre of the table. "Go on, eat." The young man looked at the food, then back at Earl. "You sure?" "I wouldn't have offered if I wasn't sure. Go on before it gets cold." The young man didn't need to be told again. He picked up Earl's fork and began to eat, slowly at first, then faster as his body remembered what real food tasted like. He shoveled mashed potatoes into his mouth, tore off pieces of meatloaf with his fingers when the fork wasn't fast enough, stuffed the cornbread in his cheeks like a squirrel storing nuts for winter. Earl watched without comment. He raised his hand to catch Dolores's attention, and when she came over, he spoke quietly. "Can we get another plate of what I had, and a large glass of orange juice, and maybe some apple pie for dessert?" Dolores looked at the young man, then back at Earl. A small smile crossed her face, and she nodded. "Coming right up, honey." The young man looked up, a piece of meatloaf still in his hand. His eyes were wet, though he was clearly trying to hold back the tears. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to. I want to. There's a difference." The young man went back to eating, but slower now, more controlled. It was as if Earl's kindness had reminded him that he was still human, that he still deserved dignity, even when circumstances had stripped away almost everything else. When Dolores returned with the second plate, the orange juice, and a promise that the pie would be out soon, the young man stared at the food like it was a mirage that might disappear at any moment. "Eat," Earl said again, "and when you're done eating, we're going to talk. Not because you owe me anything, but because I've been driving alone for a long time, and I could use the company. Deal?" The young man nodded slowly. "Deal." For the next 20 minutes, the only sounds from their booth were the scrape of a fork against the plate and the occasional clink of a glass being set down. Earl sipped his coffee and watched the parking lot through the window, giving the young man space to eat without feeling observed. When the plates were empty and the pie had been reduced to a few crumbs, the young man sat back against the vinyl booth seat and let out a long breath. Some color had returned to his cheeks, and his hands had stopped trembling. "Thank you," he said, his voice stronger now. "I don't know how to thank you enough." Earl waved his hand dismissively. No thanks necessary. Now, you want to tell me your name? I'm Earl. Earl Thompson. The young man hesitated, as if his name was something precious he wasn't sure he wanted to share. Finally, he spoke. Marcus Williams. Well, Marcus Williams, it's nice to meet you. How old are you? 22. 23 next month, if I make it that far. Earl frowned at the last part of that sentence, but didn't comment on it directly. Where are you from, Marcus? Originally, Detroit. But I haven't been back there in 3 years. What happened 3 years ago? Marcus looked down at his hands, which were now clasped together on the table. His fingernails were dirty and bitten down to the quick. Everything fell apart. My mom got sick. Cancer. Like yours. Earl's eyebrows rose. How did you know about my wife? Marcus nodded toward the ring on Earl's left hand. You're still wearing your wedding ring, but you're eating alone on a Thursday night at a truck stop. The way you looked at me when I came in, it wasn't pity. It was understanding, recognition. Like you knew what it felt like to lose everything. Earl was impressed, despite himself. You're observant. You have to be when you live on the streets. If you can't read people, you don't survive. Earl nodded slowly, accepting this. So your mom got sick. What happened then? Marcus took a deep breath and began to tell his story. It came out slowly at first, in fits and starts like water through a clogged pipe. But once he got going, the words flowed more freely, as if he had been waiting a long time for someone to listen. His mother, Denise Williams, had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer when Marcus was 19. She had been a single mother, working 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. There had never been money for health insurance, so by the time she finally saw a doctor, the cancer had spread. Marcus had dropped out of community college to take care of her. He had worked 3 jobs himself, trying to cover the mounting medical bills while also being there for his mother when she needed him. But the bills were too much, the cancer too aggressive. Denise Williams died 8 months after her diagnosis, leaving Marcus alone in the world with nothing but debt and grief. I tried to keep going, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. I really did. But the apartment was in her name, and I couldn't afford the rent on my own. I lost my jobs because I kept missing shifts. I was so tired all the time, so sad, I couldn't function. He had ended up on the streets of Detroit, sleeping in shelters when there was room, under bridges when there wasn't. He had tried to get back on his feet, but without an address, without a phone, without clean clothes for interviews, finding work was nearly impossible. The system that was supposed to help people like him was overloaded and underfunded, and Marcus had fallen through the cracks. I started walking, he continued. I don't know why. I just couldn't stay in Detroit anymore. Too many memories, too much pain. So I started walking west, hitching rides when I could, walking when I couldn't. I've been moving for almost 2 years now. Where are you trying to get to? Marcus shrugged. Nowhere specific. Anywhere. I guess I thought if I kept moving, I could outrun the past. Stupid, right? Earl shook his head. Not stupid. Human. I've been doing the same thing since my wife died. Driving from coast to coast, trying to stay ahead of the grief. It doesn't work, but it's better than standing still and letting it catch up to you. Marcus looked at Earl with something like surprise in his eyes. You understand. Better than you know. Earl paused, considering his next words carefully. Listen, Marcus, I've got a haul leaving in the morning. I'm taking a load of auto parts from here to a distribution center in Sacramento. That's about 1,800 miles. Trip'll take me about 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather's bad. Marcus waited, not understanding where this was going. I'm looking for some company, Earl continued. Someone to help keep me awake on the long stretches, maybe help with the navigation, load and unload at the stops. It's not glamorous work, but there's a cab in my rig with a bed, and I'll make sure you get 3 meals a day. What do you say? Marcus's mouth fell open. He tried to speak, but couldn't find the words. His eyes filled with tears that he didn't try to hide this time. Why? He finally managed. You don't know me. I could be anyone. I could be dangerous. Earl smiled, a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. I've been reading people for 30 years on the road. I know who's dangerous and who isn't. You're not dangerous, Marcus. You're just lost. And there was a time in my life when I was lost too, and someone helped me find my way. I figure it's time I paid that forward. Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I don't know what to say. Say yes. It's not that hard. A small laugh escaped Marcus's throat, the first genuine expression of joy he had felt in longer than he could remember. Yes. Okay. Yes. Earl nodded, satisfied. Good. Now let's get you cleaned up. There's a truck stop shower around back, and I've got some spare clothes in my rig that should fit you. They might be a little big, but they're clean. We'll head out at 6 tomorrow morning. As Earl paid the bill and led Marcus out into the cool night air, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. A reason to keep going beyond just running from his own pain. He didn't know what would happen on this trip, didn't know if he could really help this young man find his footing again. But he knew he had to try. For Marcus's sake. And for his own. The Peterbilt 579 gleamed under the parking lot lights, its chrome fixtures reflecting the glow like scattered stars. Earl had named the truck Margaret after his wife, and he treated her with the same care and devotion he had given to the woman who shared her name. He unlocked the cab and helped Marcus climb up into the passenger seat, then pointed him toward the small sleeping compartment behind the seats. Get some sleep, Earl said. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Marcus looked at the bed, at the clean sheets and the pillow, and his eyes filled with tears again. When was the last time I slept in a real bed? He murmured, more to himself than to Earl. Doesn't matter when the last time was. All that matters is tonight. Marcus crawled into the bed and was asleep within minutes, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion it had been fighting for so long. Earl stayed up for a while longer, sitting in the driver's seat and looking out at the highway that stretched into the darkness. He thought about Margaret, about the life they had built together and the life that had ended too soon. He thought about the empty house waiting for him in Kentucky, the house that had once been filled with laughter and love, and now sat silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He thought about all the miles he had driven since her death, all the sunrises and sunsets he had witnessed alone, all the meals he had eaten in diners just like this one. And he thought about Marcus, this young man who had stumbled into his life by accident or by fate. Earl wasn't a religious man, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting had been meant to happen, that somehow, in the vast randomness of the universe, 2 lost souls had found each other in a truck stop parking lot in Illinois. Maybe this is what I needed, Earl whispered to the empty cab. Maybe this is what we both needed. He settled into the driver's seat, tilted it back, and closed his eyes. Tomorrow, they would begin their journey west. Tomorrow, everything would change. The sun was just beginning to color the horizon when Earl's internal clock woke him. Years of early morning departures had trained his body to rise without an alarm, to be ready for the road before the rest of the world had even stirred. He sat up, stretched his back, and glanced toward the sleeping compartment. Marcus was still asleep, his face relaxed in a way that Earl suspected it rarely was when he was awake. In sleep, he looked younger, more vulnerable. The worry lines that creased his forehead when he was conscious had smoothed out, and his breathing was deep and even. Earl decided to let him sleep a little longer. He climbed down from the cab and made his way across the parking lot to the diner, where the morning shift was already in full swing. The smell of coffee and bacon greeted him at the door, and his stomach rumbled in anticipation. He ordered 2 breakfast specials to go, along with a large coffee for himself and an orange juice for Marcus. While he waited, he called the distribution center in Sacramento to confirm his delivery window. Everything was on schedule. When he returned to the truck, Marcus was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed and rubbing his eyes. The clothes Earl had given him the night before hung loose on his frame, but they were clean and warm, and Marcus seemed grateful for them. "Morning," Earl said, handing him the orange juice and one of the breakfast containers. "Eat up. We've got a long road ahead." Marcus accepted the food with a quiet thank you. As they ate, Earl went through his pre-trip inspection, checking the tires, the lights, the brakes, and all the other components that kept the big rig running safely. It was a ritual he had performed thousands of times, so ingrained in his routine that he could do it in his sleep. "Can I help with anything?" Marcus asked from the cab. Earl looked up at him and smiled. "Not yet, but once we're on the road, I'll teach you a few things. Might come in handy someday." They pulled out of the truck stop at 6:15, the morning light spreading across the flat Illinois farmland like honey poured from a jar. Earl navigated the rig onto Interstate 80, settling into the flow of traffic as the highway stretched out before them. For the first hour, they drove in comfortable silence. Marcus stared out the window at the passing landscape, watching as the farms gave way to small towns, and the small towns gave way to more farms. Earl focused on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes constantly scanning for hazards. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said finally. "You can ask me anything. Last night, you said someone helped you when you were lost. What did you mean by that?" Earl was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. It wasn't a story he told often, but something about Marcus made him want to share it. "I was about your age," he began. "Maybe a year or 2 younger. I had just gotten back from Vietnam. You probably learned about it in school, but you can't understand what it was like unless you were there. The things I saw, the things I did, they changed me. When I came home, I didn't know who I was anymore. I couldn't hold down a job, couldn't maintain relationships. I drank too much, slept too little. I was angry all the time, at everyone and everything." He paused to check his mirrors before continuing. "One night, I was at a bar in Louisville. I had been drinking for hours, and I was looking for a fight. I found one, with a guy twice my size. He beat me half to death and left me bleeding in the alley behind the bar. I thought I was going to die there. Part of me wanted to." Marcus listened intently, his breakfast forgotten in his hands. "A man found me in that alley. His name was Walter Jenkins. He was a truck driver just passing through town. He could have walked by, could have pretended he didn't see me. A lot of people would have. But Walter stopped. He picked me up, took me to a hospital, paid for my treatment. And when I was released, he offered me a job as his co-driver." Earl's voice softened with the memory. "I drove with Walter for 3 years. He taught me everything I know about trucking, about life, about being a man. He never judged me for my past, never made me feel ashamed of what I had become. He just showed me that there was another way to live, a better way. By the time he retired, I had saved enough money to buy my own rig, and I had found something I was good at, something that gave me purpose." "What happened to him?" Marcus asked. "To Walter? He passed away about 10 years ago, heart attack in his sleep. His wife called to tell me. I drove 500 miles to attend his funeral." Earl's voice caught for a moment. He saved my life, Marcus, not just that night in the alley, but every day after. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him." Marcus was silent for a long time, processing the story. Finally, he spoke. "And now, you're doing the same thing for me." Earl shrugged. "I don't know if I can save your life. That's not really up to me, but I can give you a chance, the same chance Walter gave me. What you do with it is up to you." Marcus turned back to the window, but Earl could see his reflection in the glass. He was crying again, silent tears streaming down his cheeks. Earl pretended not to notice, giving him the privacy to feel what he needed to feel. They crossed into Iowa just before noon, the landscape changing subtly as they left Illinois behind. The farms here were larger, the towns fewer and farther between. The sky seemed bigger somehow, stretching from horizon to horizon, without a single cloud to interrupt its vast blue expanse. Earl pulled off the highway at a rest area to stretch his legs and use the facilities. While Marcus waited in the cab, Earl made a phone call. He spoke quietly, not wanting to be overheard, and when he climbed back into the truck, he had a thoughtful expression on his face. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked. "Everything's fine, just checking in with the company." They drove through the afternoon, stopping occasionally for fuel and food. Earl began teaching Marcus the basics of trucking, explaining the gauges on the dashboard, the function of the various controls, the art of reading the road ahead and anticipating problems before they happened. Marcus proved to be a quick learner, absorbing information like a sponge. He asked intelligent questions and remembered the answers. Earl found himself impressed by the young man's mind, by the sharp intelligence that circumstances had nearly extinguished. "You ever think about going back to school?" Earl asked as they passed through Omaha. Marcus shook his head. "I've thought about it, but I don't see how it's possible. I don't have any money, any address, any identification. The system's not exactly set up for people like me." "Systems can be worked. There are programs, scholarships, opportunities. It's not easy, but it's not impossible either." "Maybe," Marcus said, but his voice was doubtful. They stopped for the night at a truck stop in Kearney, Nebraska. Earl paid for a motel room, insisting that Marcus needed a proper night's sleep in a proper bed. Marcus tried to argue, but Earl wouldn't hear it. "You need a shower, a good night's sleep, and tomorrow morning we're going to get you some clothes that actually fit," Earl said firmly. No arguments. The motel room was nothing fancy, but to Marcus it might as well have been a 5-star hotel. He stood in the hot shower for 20 minutes, watching the grime and exhaustion swirl down the drain. When he finally emerged, wrapped in a clean towel, he felt like a new person. Earl was waiting in the room with sandwiches from the diner across the street. They ate together while watching the evening news, a comfortable domesticity settling over them. It was strange, Marcus thought, how quickly he had come to trust this man, how quickly Earl had gone from stranger to something approaching family. "Earl," Marcus said during a commercial break, "can I ask you about your wife?" Earl's face softened at the question. "Margaret? What do you want to know?" "Whatever you want to tell me. You don't have to if it's too hard." Earl was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "It's not too hard. Talking about her keeps her alive in a way, keeps the memories fresh." He told Marcus about how they had met at a county fair in rural Kentucky, both of them barely out of their teens. Margaret had been working at a cotton candy booth, and Earl had gone back 7 times just to talk to her. They had been married 6 months later, and they had been inseparable ever since. "She was my anchor," Earl said. "When I was on the road, she was home waiting for me. When I came back, she was there with open arms. She made me want to be better than I was, to live up to the man she believed I could be. When she died," he trailed off, his voice breaking. "You don't have to," Marcus said softly. "No, it's okay." Earl took a deep breath. When she died, I lost my anchor. I started drifting. That's why I keep driving, keep moving. If I stop, I have to face the emptiness. And I'm not sure I'm strong enough for that yet. Marcus nodded, understanding perfectly. I feel the same way, about my mum. About everything. Then maybe we can help each other, Earl said. Maybe together we can learn to stop running. They sat in companionable silence until the news came back on, two broken souls finding comfort in each other's company. Outside, the Nebraska night wrapped around the motel like a blanket, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the plains. The morning brought clear skies and a renewed sense of purpose. After breakfast at a local diner, Earl took Marcus to a Walmart and bought him a week's worth of clothes, toiletries, and a pair of sturdy work boots. Marcus protested at first, but Earl insisted. "Consider it an advance on your wages," Earl said. "You'll work it off before we get to Sacramento." They were back on the road by 9, crossing into Wyoming as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The landscape had changed dramatically now, the flat farmlands of Nebraska giving way to rolling hills and distant mountains. Marcus stared out the window in wonder, having never seen anything like it. "First time in Wyoming?" Earl asked. "First time west of Missouri," Marcus admitted. "I've seen pictures, but pictures don't do it justice." Earl nodded knowingly. "Wait until we get to Utah. The rock formations there will blow your mind." As they drove, they continued their conversations, peeling back layers of each other's lives like onion skins. Marcus told Earl about his childhood in Detroit, about the father who had abandoned them before Marcus was old enough to remember, about the mother who had worked herself to the bone to give him a better life. He talked about his dreams of becoming an engineer, of building things that would make the world better, dreams that had died along with his mother. Earl shared more stories of his years on the road, of the strange and wonderful people he had met, of the sunrises over deserts and sunsets over oceans. He talked about Margaret, about their struggles to have children that never came, about the peace they had eventually found in each other's company. He talked about regrets and joys, failures and triumphs, all the things that made up a life lived fully. "Do you ever regret not having kids?" Marcus asked. Earl considered the question. "I used to. We tried for years, but it wasn't meant to be. Eventually we accepted it and found other ways to fill our lives. Margaret volunteered at the local school, helped out with the children there. I mentored younger drivers, tried to pass on what I had learned." He paused. "But sometimes, late at night, I wonder what it would have been like to have someone carry on after I'm gone." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, I think you would have been a great dad." The words hit Earl harder than he expected. He had to blink back tears before he could respond. "Thank you, Marcus. That means more than you know." They crossed into Utah in the late afternoon, and true to Earl's prediction, the landscape took Marcus's breath away. Red rock formations rose from the earth like ancient cathedrals, their layers of color telling a story millions of years in the making. The setting sun painted them in shades of gold and crimson, a natural light show that no human artist could ever replicate. "Pull over," Marcus said suddenly. "Please, I need to see this." Earl found a scenic overlook and brought the truck to a stop. They climbed out and stood at the edge of the parking area, looking out at the vast expanse of desert and rock and sky. The wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something ancient and eternal. "I've driven through here hundreds of times," Earl said, "and it never gets old. Every time is like the first time." Marcus just nodded, words failing him in the face of such beauty. They stood there for a long time, two small figures against the backdrop of geological time, watching as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars began to appear. "Thank you," Marcus finally whispered. "For what?" "For bringing me here. for showing me there's still beauty in the world. I had forgotten. Earl put a hand on the young man's shoulder. There's always beauty, Marcus. Sometimes you just have to travel a long way to find it. They slept in the cab that night, parked at a rest stop with a view of the mountains. Earl took the driver's seat, tilted back as far as it would go, while Marcus curled up in the sleeping compartment. The silence of the desert night wrapped around them, broken only by the occasional passing truck and the distant howl of coyotes. "Earl?" Marcus's voice drifted from the darkness. "Yeah? I'm glad I walked into that diner." Earl smiled, though Marcus couldn't see it. "Me too, son. Me too." The word hung in the air between them, unexpected and powerful. Earl hadn't meant to say it, hadn't even realized he was thinking it, but once it was out, he didn't take it back. And Marcus didn't ask him to. They crossed into Nevada the next morning, the desert stretching endlessly on either side of the highway. Earl explained the geography as they drove, pointing out landmarks and sharing bits of history he had picked up over the years. Marcus listened attentively, adding each piece of information to the growing collection in his mind. "You know a lot," Marcus observed. "When you spend as much time alone on the road as I have, you find ways to keep your mind occupied. I've read hundreds of audiobooks, listened to thousands of hours of podcasts. Learning keeps the loneliness at bay." They stopped for lunch at a small town called Winnemucca, finding a family-owned restaurant that served surprisingly good Mexican food. Over tacos and enchiladas, their conversation turned to the future. "What are you going to do when we get to Sacramento?" Marcus asked. Earl had been thinking about this. "I've got to drop this load and pick up another one heading back east. The company wants me in Denver by the end of the week." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I've been making some calls. There's a community college in Sacramento with a good engineering program. They have financial aid for students in difficult circumstances, and there's a transitional housing program nearby that helps people get back on their feet." Marcus's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "You've been making calls. I hope you don't mind." I asked around, pulled a few strings. "There's a man I know at the college, a professor in the engineering department. His name is Dr. James Anderson. He's agreed to meet with you, hear your story, see what can be done." Marcus set down his fork, his face a mixture of emotions. Hope and fear warred in his eyes, neither able to gain the upper hand. "Earl, I don't know if I can do this. I've been out of school for 3 years. I don't have transcripts, references, any of the things they'll want. Those things can be worked out. Dr. Anderson knows your situation. He's not expecting a traditional applicant. He's expecting someone with potential, someone who's been dealt a bad hand but hasn't given up. You're that person, Marcus. But what if I fail? What if I'm not smart enough, or I can't keep up, or I mess everything up again?" Earl reached across the table and gripped Marcus's arm firmly. "Then you'll try again. And if you fail again, you'll try again after that. Success isn't about never falling, Marcus. It's about getting up every time you fall. You've already proven you can do that. You've survived things that would have broken most people. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Why are you doing all this for me? You barely know me." Earl released his arm and sat back in his chair. "Because someone did it for me once. Because I've spent the last 18 months trying to outrun my grief, and this is the first time I've felt like I'm running towards something instead of away from something. Because Margaret would have wanted me to." He smiled. "And because I believe in you. Is that enough?" Marcus wiped his eyes with his napkin. "It's more than enough." They finished their meal and got back on the road, crossing the California state line in the late afternoon. The Sierra Nevada mountains rose up before them, their peaks still dusted with snow despite the spring warmth. Earl navigated the climb with practiced ease, the powerful engine of the Peterbilt making short work of the steep grades. As they descended into the central valley, the landscape changed once again. Orchards and vineyards spread out on either side of the highway, a patchwork of green that contrasted sharply with the brown desert they had left behind. The air smelled different here, fertile and alive. "California," Marcus breathed. "I never thought I'd see it." "It's not the promised land," Earl cautioned. "It's got problems just like everywhere else. But it's a good place for a new start, if you're willing to work for it." They arrived at the distribution center in Sacramento, just as the sun was setting. Earl backed the rig into the loading dock with the precision of decades of practice, and they waited while workers unloaded the cargo. When the paperwork was signed and the trailer was empty, Earl drove to a nearby truck stop and parked for the night. "The meeting with Dr. Anderson is tomorrow at 10, Earl said. "There's a shelter nearby where you can stay tonight, and they can help you get to the college in the morning." Marcus shook his head. "Can I stay here, with you, just one more night?" Earl didn't hesitate. "Of course." They had dinner at the truck stop diner, another meal, in another booth in another anonymous roadside establishment. But this time, the atmosphere was different. There was a sense of ending, of a chapter coming to a close. "I'm scared," Marcus admitted over his coffee. "That's normal. Being scared means you care about the outcome. It means this matters to you." "What if I never see you again?" Earl reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, which he slid across the table to Marcus. On it was written a phone number. "That's my cell. You can call me any time, day or night. If things get hard, if you need advice, if you just want to talk, you call that number. I'll answer." Marcus looked at the paper like it was made of gold. "Thank you. And when I'm passing through California, which happens every month or so, I'll look you up. We'll grab a meal, catch up on how things are going. You're not getting rid of me that easily." Marcus laughed, a genuine laugh that transformed his face. Earl realized he was seeing, perhaps for the first time, what Marcus looked like when he was happy. It was a good look. They talked late into the night, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Earl told Marcus about his plans to eventually retire, to buy a small house somewhere quiet and spend his remaining years reading and fishing and maybe finally learning to cook properly. Marcus talked about his aspirations, about the bridges and buildings he wanted to design, about giving back to communities like the one where he had grown up. "I want to help people," Marcus said, "people like me who fell through the cracks. I want to build things that make their lives better." "You will," Earl said with certainty. "I know you will." When they finally fell asleep, the cab of the truck felt smaller than before, but also warmer. Two people who had been alone in the world had found each other, and even though they would soon part ways, they would never truly be alone again. The morning came too quickly. Earl drove Marcus to the college campus, a collection of modern buildings surrounded by green lawns and towering oak trees. Students walked between classes, their faces young and full of promise. Marcus watched them with a mixture of longing and intimidation. "This is it," Earl said, pulling up to the administration building. Marcus didn't move. He sat in the passenger seat, his new clothes crisp and clean, his hair combed for the first time in months. He looked like a different person from the starving young man who had walked into that Illinois diner just 3 days ago. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered. "You can." Earl's voice was firm. "You've survived things that would have destroyed most people. You've walked across half the country with nothing but the clothes on your back. You've kept going when every rational part of you wanted to give up. This is just another step on that journey, and this time you're not alone." Marcus turned to look at him, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I don't know how to thank you." "Thank me by succeeding. By building those bridges and buildings you dreamed about, by helping others the way I helped you. That's how you thank me." Marcus reached over and hugged Earl, a fierce, desperate embrace that communicated everything words couldn't. Earl hugged him back, feeling his own eyes grow moist. "Go on," Earl said when they finally separated. "Dr. Anderson is waiting for you, and I've got a truck to get to Denver." Marcus climbed down from the cab, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He stood on the sidewalk and looked up at Earl one last time. "I'll make you proud," he said. "You already have, son. You already have." Earl watched as Marcus walked toward the building, his stride growing more confident with each step. At the door, he turned and waved. Earl waved back, and then Marcus disappeared inside. Earl sat in the cab for a long moment, staring at the closed door. Then he took a deep breath, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. He had a delivery to make, a schedule to keep, a life to continue living. But as he navigated through the Sacramento streets toward the highway, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, not just for Marcus, but for himself. The road ahead was still long, the grief still present, but it no longer felt quite as heavy. He had done something good, something meaningful, and that made all the difference. He merged onto Interstate 80 East, the same highway he had traveled so many times before. The morning sun was warm on his face, and the miles spread out before him like an invitation. Earl Thompson was going home, but for the first time in 18 months, he felt like he might actually want to get there. 6 months later, Earl's phone rang while he was parked at a rest stop in Kansas. The number on the screen made him smile before he even answered. "Marcus, how are you, son?" "Earl, I'm good." "Really good, I've got news." Earl could hear the excitement in Marcus's voice, and it lifted his spirits in a way that nothing else had in years. "Tell me everything." "I made the dean's list. First semester, straight A's. Dr. Anderson says I'm one of the best students he's ever had. And I got a job on campus, working in the engineering lab. It doesn't pay much, but it covers my expenses and gives me hands-on experience." "That's incredible, Marcus. I knew you could do it." "And that's not all. The transitional housing program has been amazing. I've got a small apartment now, nothing fancy, but it's mine. I've got a bed and a kitchen and a door I can lock. Do you know how long it's been since I had a door I could lock?" Earl laughed, joy bubbling up from somewhere deep inside. "I'm so proud of you." "I couldn't have done it without you, Earl. You know that, right? You saved my life that night in the diner." "You saved mine too," Earl said quietly. "You just didn't know it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I want to see you. Can you come out here? I want to introduce you to Dr. Anderson, show you the campus, cook you dinner in my new apartment. I've been learning to cook, actually. I'm not very good yet, but I'm getting better. I've got a delivery in Los Angeles next week. I could swing through Sacramento on my way back east. Would that work?" "That would be perfect." They talked for another 20 minutes, catching up on the details of each other's lives. Earl told Marcus about the changes he was making, how he had started visiting a grief counselor in Louisville, how he was finally starting to go through Margaret's things instead of leaving them untouched like a shrine. Marcus shared stories about his classes, his professors, his new friends at the housing program. When they finally hung up, Earl sat in the silence of his cab and let the tears come. They weren't tears of sadness, though. They were tears of something else entirely: pride, joy, gratitude, the knowledge that in a world that could be so cruel, there was still room for kindness, for connection, for the kind of transformation that changed lives forever. He had gone into that diner looking for a meal and had found something infinitely more valuable: a purpose, a connection, a son in every way that mattered, if not by blood, then by choice. Earl started the engine and pulled back onto the highway. The road stretched out before him, endless and familiar, but it no longer felt lonely. Every mile brought him closer to Sacramento, to Marcus, to the new chapter of his life that was unfolding in ways he never could have predicted. The sun was setting as he drove, painting the Kansas sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Earl thought about all the sunsets he had watched alone over the years, all the beautiful moments he had experienced with no one to share them. That time was over now. He had someone to share them with again. He picked up his phone and sent a quick text to Marcus. "Beautiful sunset here in Kansas. Wish you could see it." The response came back almost immediately. "Take a picture. I'll be seeing a lot of them soon." Earl smiled and drove on into the gathering night, his heart fuller than it had been in years. The road was long, but he was no longer traveling it alone. The reunion in Sacramento was everything Earl had hoped it would be, and more. Marcus was waiting for him at the same truck stop where they had parted ways 6 months earlier. But he was nearly unrecognizable. He had gained weight, healthy weight that filled out his frame and added color to his cheeks. His clothes fit properly, his hair was neatly trimmed, and he carried himself with a confidence that hadn't been there before. "Earl!" Marcus rushed forward as soon as Earl climbed down from the cab, embracing him in a bear hug that lifted the older man off his feet. "Easy there," Earl laughed. "I'm not as young as I used to be." "You look great," Marcus said, stepping back to appraise him. "Better than before. Happier." "I could say the same about you." Earl clapped him on the shoulder. "College life agrees with you." They drove to the campus in Earl's truck, Marcus pointing out landmarks and explaining his route to class as they went. The enthusiasm in his voice was infectious, and Earl found himself hanging on every word. Dr. Anderson met them at the engineering building, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and a warm smile. He shook Earl's hand firmly. "So you're the mysterious trucker I've heard so much about. Marcus talks about you constantly." Earl felt his face flush. "I just gave him a ride. He did all the hard work." "Don't be modest. I've been teaching for 40 years and I know talent when I see it. But talent alone doesn't account for the transformation I've witnessed in this young man. Someone believed in him when he had stopped believing in himself. That's not nothing, Mr. Thompson. That's everything." They spent the afternoon touring the campus, visiting Marcus's favorite spots, meeting his friends and professors. Earl watched in amazement as Marcus navigated his new world with ease and grace, a far cry from the terrified young man who had hesitated to sit in a diner booth just half a year earlier. That evening, Marcus cooked dinner in his small apartment. The meal was simple, spaghetti and salad, but it was prepared with care and served with pride. They sat at Marcus's tiny kitchen table, eating and laughing and sharing stories like old friends. "I've been thinking," Marcus said as they finished their meal, "about what I want to do after I graduate. And what's that? I want to start a non-profit, something that helps young people who are in the same situation I was in. People who have fallen through the cracks, who don't have anyone to help them back up. I want to be for them what you were for me." Earl set down his fork, overcome with emotion. "That's a wonderful goal, Marcus. I'm going to call it the Margaret Thompson Foundation." Earl's breath caught in his throat. He tried to speak, but couldn't find the words. "If that's okay with you," Marcus added quickly. "I should have asked first." Earl shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "It's more than okay. It's perfect. She would have loved it. She would have loved you." Marcus reached across the table and took Earl's hand. "She raised a good man. Even if she wasn't around to see it, she helped make you who you are, and who you are saved my life. So in a way, she saved my life too." They sat in silence for a moment, two men connected by fate and circumstance, and the simple act of kindness that had started it all. Outside, the Sacramento night was alive with the sounds of the city, but inside the small apartment, there was only peace. "I've been thinking too," Earl said finally, "about what comes next for me." "Tell me." "I'm going to retire at the end of the year. I've got enough saved up to buy a small place, nothing fancy. I was thinking somewhere in the Sacramento area, close enough to visit, Far enough to give you your space." Marcus's face lit up. "Really? You'd move out here?" "If you'll have me." "Earl, nothing would make me happier." They talked late into the night, making plans for the future. Earl would find a house with a spare bedroom for when Marcus needed a break from the dorms. Marcus would spend holidays with Earl instead of alone in an empty apartment. They would take road trips together, exploring the coast and the mountains and all the places neither of them had seen. "We're a family now," Marcus said as they finally said goodnight. "You know that, right?" Earl nodded, his heart full to bursting. "I know, and I couldn't be more grateful." 3 years later, Earl sat in the audience of the Sacramento Convention Center, watching as Marcus walked across the stage to receive his engineering degree. The young man was magna cum laude, top of his class, with job offers from firms across the country. But more importantly, he was happy, healthy, whole. Earl clapped until his hands hurt, tears streaming down his weathered face. In the seat beside him sat Dr. Anderson, and behind them were friends from the transitional housing program and classmates who had become like brothers and sisters to Marcus. When Marcus received his diploma, he looked out into the audience and caught Earl's eye. He held the diploma aloft in triumph, and Earl could read his lips. "We did it." After the ceremony, they gathered for a celebration at Earl's new house, a modest ranch-style home just outside the city. The backyard was strung with lights, and the tables were laden with food prepared by friends and neighbors. Marcus stood in front of the gathered crowd and raised his glass. "I want to make a toast," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "To the man who changed my life. 3 years ago, I walked into a truck stop diner in Illinois with nothing. No money, no hope, no future. I was rehearsing what I would say to strangers to beg for their leftovers. And a man looked at me, saw something worth saving, and said 2 words that changed everything. 'Sit here.'" He turned to Earl, who was standing nearby with tears in his eyes. "Earl Thompson didn't know me from Adam. He had no reason to help me, no obligation to care. But he did. He fed me, clothed me, gave me a place to sleep. He drove me across the country and introduced me to people who could help me get back on my feet. He believed in me when I had stopped believing in myself." Marcus's voice cracked with emotion, but he pressed on. "I stand here today, a college graduate with a future I never dared to dream of, because one man decided to be kind. One man decided that a stranger's suffering was worth addressing. One man decided that I mattered." He raised his glass higher. "To Earl Thompson, my mentor, my friend, my father in every way that counts." The crowd raised their glasses in unison. "To Earl." Earl stepped forward and embraced Marcus, holding him tight as the applause washed over them. When they finally separated, both men were crying openly, and neither was ashamed. "You did this," Earl said. "You did all the hard work. I just pointed you in the right direction. You did more than that, and you know it." Marcus smiled through his tears. "But I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving that your faith in me wasn't misplaced. I'm going to help others the way you helped me." "That's a promise." "I know you will, son. I've never doubted it for a second." The party continued late into the night, filled with laughter and stories and the warmth of community. As Earl watched Marcus move through the crowd, accepting congratulations and sharing his plans for the future, he felt a profound sense of peace. Margaret was gone, and the grief of losing her would never fully disappear. But in its place, something new had grown. A purpose, a connection. A family forged not by blood, but by choice, by the simple act of reaching out a hand to someone in need. Earl thought about Walter Jenkins, the man who had pulled him from an alley in Louisville all those years ago. Walter was gone now too, but his legacy lived on. It lived in Earl, who had passed his kindness to Marcus. It would live in Marcus, who would pass it to others. It was an unbroken chain of compassion, stretching back into the past and forward into the future. This is how we save each other, Earl realized. Not through grand gestures or heroic acts, but through the small kindnesses that say, I see you, I care, you matter. He looked up at the stars, scattered like diamonds across the California sky, and smiled. Thank you, Margaret, he whispered. Thank you, Walter. Thank you for showing me the way. Somewhere in the distance, a truck horn sounded on the highway, and Earl felt a familiar pull. The road was still out there, waiting. But for the first time in his life, he didn't need it. He had found what he was looking for. He had found home. The Margaret Thompson Foundation launched the following year, with Marcus as its executive director and Earl as its honorary chairman. The Foundation's mission was simple: to identify young people in crisis and provide them with the support they needed to transform their lives: housing, education, job training, mental health services, everything that Marcus had needed and more. The first fundraiser was held at a truck stop in Illinois, the same one where Earl and Marcus had met. Truckers from across the country drove hundreds of miles to attend, donating what they could and sharing their own stories of hardship and redemption. The local news covered the event and the story went viral. Within a year, the foundation had helped dozens of young people get back on their feet. Within 3 years, that number had grown to hundreds. Marcus traveled the country, speaking at conferences and universities, sharing his story and inspiring others to look for the lost souls in their own communities. It starts with one question, he would always say. It starts with asking, is there any food left on your plate? It starts with saying, sit here. It starts with seeing someone who is invisible to everyone else and deciding that they matter. Earl attended as many events as his aging body would allow, watching with pride as his son moved through the world, changing lives with every step. On his 75th birthday, the foundation threw him a party at the Sacramento Convention Center, the same venue where Marcus had graduated. 300 people attended, including former recipients of the foundation's services who had gone on to build successful lives of their own. Marcus gave a speech that night, one that would be quoted and shared for years to come. When I was at my lowest, he said, I asked myself a question. Is there any food left on your plate? I was rehearsing, you see, practicing what I would say to strangers to beg for scraps. I had no pride left, no dignity. I was a ghost, invisible to everyone around me. He paused, looking out at the crowd. But one man saw me. One man heard me. And instead of turning away, he put down his fork and said, sit here. 2 words. That's all it took. 2 words, and my entire life changed. He turned to where Earl sat in the front row, his eyes filled with tears. Earl Thompson taught me that we all have the power to change someone's life. We don't need money or influence or special skills. We just need to see the people around us, really see them, and then we need to act, to reach out, to say, sit here, you're not alone anymore. The crowd rose to its feet, applause thundering through the convention center. Earl stood too, though his legs were unsteady now and he needed a cane to keep his balance. Marcus crossed the stage and helped him up the steps, and together they faced the crowd. This man saved my life, Marcus said, his voice breaking, and through me he saved hundreds of others. His kindness has rippled out into the world in ways he never could have imagined. That's the power of compassion. That's the power of seeing someone and choosing to help. Earl took the microphone, his hands trembling but his voice strong. I'm just a trucker, he said simply. I've spent my life on the road, watching America pass by through my windshield. I've seen a lot of things, good and bad, but the best thing I ever did was stop at a diner in Illinois and meet this young man. He looked at Marcus, love shining in his eyes. Margaret used to say that we're all connected, that every kindness we do ripples out into the world and touches lives we'll never know. I didn't believe her at first. I was too cynical, too focused on my own problems. But she was right. She was always right. His voice caught, but he pressed on. So, I want to ask all of you to do something. The next time you see someone struggling, the next time you have the chance to help and it would be easier to walk away, I want you to stop. I want you to see them. I want you to say, sit here, because you never know whose life you might change. You never know what ripples you might create. He raised his cane in a mock toast. To kindness, he said, to connection, to the beautiful broken people who wander into our lives and make us whole again. To kindness, the crowd echoed. Earl handed the microphone back to Marcus and let his son help him down from the stage. As they walked through the crowd together, people reached out to shake Earl's hand, to thank him, to share their own stories of transformation. And Earl realized that this was his legacy, not the millions of miles he had driven, not the countless loads he had delivered. These lives touched, these ripples created, this chain of kindness that would continue long after he was gone. He thought about Margaret, about Walter, about all the people who had helped him along the way. They were all part of this too. Every act of kindness was connected, an endless web of compassion that spanned generations and continents. "Thank you," he whispered to no one and everyone at once. "Thank you for showing me the way." Outside, the Sacramento night was warm and fragrant with the smell of jasmine. Earl and Marcus stood together in the parking lot, looking up at the stars. "You okay?" Marcus asked. "Better than okay," Earl replied. "I'm at peace." They stood in silence for a moment, two men who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and had built something beautiful from the ruins of their respective pasts. "I love you, Earl," Marcus said. "I love you too, son." And there, under the California stars, with the sounds of the celebration still drifting from inside the convention center, Earl Thompson knew that his life had meant something, that all the pain and loss and loneliness had led him to this moment. That in the end, love had won. The foundation continued to grow in the years that followed. By its 10th anniversary, it had helped thousands of young people across the country, providing them with the resources and support they needed to transform their lives. Marcus had become a sought-after speaker and advocate, his story inspiring millions. Earl passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, surrounded by family and friends. Marcus was at his bedside, holding his hand as he took his final breath. The funeral was held at a small church in Sacramento, but truckers from across the nation sent flowers and messages of condolence. The parking lot was filled with 18-wheelers, their chrome fixtures gleaming in the afternoon sun. At the service, Marcus delivered the eulogy. He spoke about Earl's life on the road, his love for Margaret, his quiet strength and unwavering kindness. But mostly, he spoke about that night in the Illinois diner, the night that had changed everything. "Earl Thompson didn't set out to be a hero," Marcus said. "He was just a trucker, eating his dinner after a long day on the road. But when he saw someone in need, he didn't look away. He reached out. He said, 'Sit here.' And in doing so, he changed my life. He changed countless lives." Marcus paused, composing himself. "The last thing Earl said to me was this: 'Keep the chain going.' He meant the chain of kindness, the ripples of compassion that spread out from every good deed. He wanted me to keep helping others, to keep passing on the gift he had given me." He looked out at the congregation, his eyes bright with tears, but his voice steady. "And I will. I promise you, Earl, I will. The chain won't be broken. Your legacy will live on." After the service, Marcus drove to the truck stop in Illinois where he and Earl had first met. It looked different now, renovated and expanded, but the diner was still there, serving the same meatloaf and mashed potatoes that Earl had ordered that fateful night. Marcus sat in the same booth where Earl had sat, looking out at the parking lot. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, just like it had on so many evenings when Earl was on the road. A young woman approached his table. She looked tired, her clothes worn, her eyes haunted. Marcus recognized the look. He had worn it himself once upon a time. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is there any food left on your plate?" Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a familiar feeling, a sense of purpose and connection. He thought about Earl, about Walter, about all the people who had been part of this chain. He thought about the ripples that spread out from every act of kindness, touching lives in ways we can never fully understand. He smiled and gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit here," he said, and the chain continued. Outside, the trucks rumbled past on the highway, their headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. America stretched out in every direction, vast and beautiful and filled with lost souls searching for their way home. And in a small diner in Illinois, a young woman sat down across from a stranger who saw her, who cared, who reached out a hand to help. This is how we save each other. One meal at a time, one moment at a time, one act of kindness rippling out into the infinite future. Sit here. You're not alone anymore. The story doesn't end. It can't end. Because every time someone reaches out to help another person in need, the chain grows stronger. Every time someone sees the invisible and chooses to act, the ripples spread further. Earl Thompson may be gone, but what he started lives on in Marcus, in the thousands of lives the foundation has touched, in every trucker who stops to help a stranded motorist, in every stranger who offers a meal to someone hungry. That's the power of kindness. That's the legacy of a simple question and a simpler answer. "Is there any food left on your plate, sir?" "Sit here." 2 words that changed everything. 2 words that continue to change everything every day all over the world. And somewhere, perhaps, Earl and Margaret are watching, smiling, proud of the seeds they planted and the forest that has grown from them. The road goes on forever, but we don't have to travel it alone. Marcus continued to run the Margaret Thompson Foundation for the next 30 years, expanding its reach and impact until it became one of the largest homeless youth advocacy organizations in the country. He married a woman he met through the foundation, a former recipient who had gone on to become a social worker. They had 3 children, and each of them learned the story of Earl Thompson from the time they could understand words. "Grandpa Earl wasn't your real grandfather," Marcus would tell them, "but he was more of a father to me than anyone else in the world. And he taught me the most important lesson I've ever learned, that we all have the power to change someone's life. That kindness matters, that every person we meet is fighting a battle we know nothing about, and sometimes the smallest gesture can make the biggest difference." The children grew up volunteering at the foundation, learning to see the invisible and reach out to those in need. They carried Earl's legacy forward, each in their own way. One became a social worker, one a teacher, one a truck driver who traveled the country looking for lost souls to help. And every Thanksgiving, no matter where they were or what they were doing, the family gathered at a truck stop diner to share a meal. They would order meatloaf and mashed potatoes, raise their glasses, and toast to the man who had started it all. "To Earl," they would say, "to kindness, to the chain that never breaks." And then they would eat and laugh and share stories, a family bound not by blood, but by love, by choice, by the simple act of seeing someone in need and saying, "Sit here." The diner was always crowded on Thanksgiving, filled with travelers and truckers and families on the road. And every year, without fail, someone would wander in who looked like they could use a hot meal, someone tired, someone hungry, someone who had lost their way. And every year Marcus would catch their eye and gesture to an empty seat. "Sit here," he would say, because that's what Earl would have done. That's what the chain required. That's how the ripples continued to spread, touching lives in ways that no one could predict or measure. This is the story of Earl Thompson and Marcus Williams, a trucker and a homeless young man. Two people who found each other at a crossroads and changed each other's lives forever. But really, this is everyone's story. This is the story of every person who has ever been lost and found, who has ever been seen by someone when they felt invisible, who has ever been saved by a simple act of kindness. Because we are all connected, every one of us, and every act of kindness, no matter how small, creates ripples that spread out into the world in ways we can never fully understand. So the next time you see someone struggling, the next time you have the chance to help, and it would be easier to walk away, remember Earl Thompson. Remember the diner in Illinois. Remember the two words that changed everything. Sit here and watch the ripples spread. Years passed, and the world changed in ways both wonderful and terrible. Technology advanced, cities grew, the climate shifted, and new challenges arose to test humanity's resilience. But through it all, the Margaret Thompson Foundation continued its work, adapting to meet the needs of each new generation of young people in crisis. Marcus grew old, his hair turning silver, his steps slowing. But his spirit remained unchanged, the same fierce compassion that had defined him since that night in the Illinois diner. He continued to visit truck stops across the country, sharing his story and looking for those who needed help. On his 75th birthday, the same age Earl had been when he retired, Marcus announced that he was stepping down as executive director of the foundation. In his place, he had chosen a young woman named Grace, a former recipient who had come through the program 15 years earlier and had dedicated her life to carrying on its mission. "The chain continues," Marcus said at the announcement ceremony. "That's what matters, not who's leading, not who gets the credit, but that the work goes on. That we keep seeing the invisible, keep reaching out, keep saying, 'Sit here,' to those who have nowhere else to go." Grace, who had been homeless at 16 after aging out of foster care, stood beside him with tears in her eyes. "I am who I am because of this foundation," she said, "because Marcus saw me when I was invisible, because Earl Thompson, a man I never met, started a chain of kindness that reached all the way down to me. I will spend the rest of my life making sure that chain keeps growing." After the ceremony, Marcus drove out to the Sacramento Cemetery where Earl was buried. It was a beautiful spot, under an oak tree that provided shade even on the hottest days. Margaret was buried beside him, their headstones simple and elegant, adorned with a quote from Earl's favorite poem, "The road goes on forever." Marcus sat on the bench facing their graves and spoke to them as he always did, sharing the news of his life and the foundation's work. "We helped 10,000 kids this year," he said. 10,000, Earl. Can you believe it? 10,000 young people who got a second chance because of what you started. The wind rustled the leaves of the oak tree, and Marcus liked to imagine it was Earl responding, nodding in approval. "I'm retiring now," Marcus continued. "Grace will take over. She's extraordinary, Earl. You would have loved her. She's got the same fire you had, the same determination to make a difference." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot lately about that night in the diner, about how close I came to giving up. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't looked up at exactly the right moment, if you hadn't said those two words, I don't know where I'd be. I don't know if I'd be at all." Marcus felt the familiar sting of tears, but he didn't try to hold them back. "You saved my life, Earl, and through me, you've saved thousands of others. Your kindness has rippled out into the world in ways neither of us could have imagined, and it won't stop. I promise you it won't stop." He reached out and touched Earl's headstone, the marble cool and smooth under his fingertips. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything, for seeing me, for reaching out, for saying, 'Sit here,' when I needed it most. I'll see you again someday, old friend, and when I do, I'll have stories to tell you. Stories of all the lives that were changed because of what you did." He sat there for a long time, watching the sun move across the sky, listening to the birds sing in the branches overhead, and when he finally rose to leave, he felt at peace. The chain was secure. The legacy was intact. The ripples would continue to spread long after he was gone. Marcus lived for another decade, surrounded by his family and friends, still visiting truck stops when his health allowed, still sharing his story with anyone who would listen. When he died at 85, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the foundation he had built. His son, Earl Marcus Williams, delivered the eulogy. "My father used to tell us that we're all just truckers on the road of life," he said. "We're all heading somewhere, carrying our loads, trying to make it through another day, and sometimes we break down, sometimes we lose our way, but if we're lucky, we find someone who's willing to stop and help us get back on the road." He looked out at the congregation, his eyes finding the faces of foundation recipients, former truckers, family members, and friends. "That's what my father did for thousands of people. That's what Earl Thompson did for him. And that's what we're all called to do for each other, not because we have to, not because we'll get anything in return, but because it's right, because kindness matters, because every person we meet is fighting a battle we know nothing about, and sometimes the smallest gesture can make the biggest difference." He raised his hand as if giving a toast. "To my father, Marcus Williams, to Earl Thompson, to Margaret Thompson, and to everyone who has ever stopped to help a stranger, to say, 'Sit here,' to keep the chain of kindness growing. May their legacy live forever." "May their legacy live forever," the congregation echoed. And it did. The chain continued, unbroken, passed from one generation to the next. The foundation thrived, touching millions of lives over the decades that followed. The story of Earl and Marcus became legendary, taught in schools and shared at truck stops, a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And every year, on the anniversary of that fateful night in Illinois, people all over the country performed random acts of kindness in honor of Earl Thompson. They bought meals for strangers. They helped those in need. They reached out to the invisible and said, "Sit here. You're not alone." The ripples spread. The chain grew. The legacy lived on, because that's what kindness does. It doesn't die with the people who practice it. It grows, it multiplies, it touches lives in ways we can never fully understand or measure. Earl Thompson was just a trucker, eating his dinner at a truck stop in Illinois. He had no idea that his simple act of generosity would change the world. He just saw someone in need and chose to help. And that's all it takes. That's the secret, if there is one. Just see, just care, just reach out. Sit here, 2 words, a lifetime of impact, a legacy that will never end. This is the story of Earl Thompson and Marcus Williams. But really, it's your story too. It's all of our stories, because we all have the power to be that person in the diner. We all have the chance to see someone who is invisible and say, "Sit here." So go, do it. Be the person who stops. Be the person who helps. Be the link in a chain that stretches back through generations and forward into infinity. The road goes on forever, but you don't have to travel it alone. None of us do. Not anymore. And in truck stops and diners across America, the tradition continues. Strangers help strangers. Truckers feed the hungry. Those who have been saved become saviors themselves. The chain grows stronger every day, and somewhere Earl Thompson is smiling. Sit here, the world says to those who are lost. Sit here and let me help you find your way home. That's all. That's everything. Kindness. Connection. Love the end? No, the beginning, always and forever the beginning.